Ever hear that saying, it's just like riding a bicycle you never forget? Well, today we're going to dive into some research that really challenges that whole idea.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
We're talking about the work of Phillip L. Ackerman and Corey E. Tatel from Georgia Tech, right?
That's right, out of the School of Psychology.
They really dug into whether skills really stick around or if they kind of fade away over time.
And what's really interesting is they didn't just do one study, they took a look at decades of research on skill retention.
So like a massive overview.
Exactly. They did a meta-analysis, which means they analyzed data from tons of existing studies, and they found some pretty significant flaws in how this kind of research has been done.
Okay, so they were like the mythbusters of skill decay research, finding the weak spots in our understanding. That's kind of huge. What kind of flaws are we talking about here?
Well, for starters, a lot of studies didn't even directly measure skill retention. They might compare different ways of training someone, but never actually look at how well people held on to that skill over time.
It's like saying a new recipe book is amazing, but never checking if people actually remember how to make the dishes a few months later, right?
Exactly. And then there's the issue of how performance was measured. Some studies focused only on speed, others just on accuracy.
Right, because those two things don't always go together. I can type crazy fast, but my accuracy, well, let's just say I'm very well acquainted with the backspace key.
Huh. Exactly. And sometimes they even use measures that didn't really get at whether someone still had the skill or not. Then you've got the third problem. A lot of studies just didn't report their statistics in a way that makes it easy to figure out what the heck was going on. And fourth, they didn't always consider what people were doing in that time period between learning and being tested.
So like if you take a pottery class and then, surprise, every weekend you end up making little clay animals with your niece, maybe that explains why you're still pretty good at molding a paw.
Exactly, you got it. And then the fifth issue is this tricky thing of separating actual skill retention from how fast someone can relearn something. Just because you're a little rusty doesn't mean you've completely lost the skill.
Yeah, right. Like that moment when you try to speak a language you haven't used in ages. You might sound a bit like a broken record at first, but does that mean it's gone completely? Or are you just kind of rebooting those language circuits in your brain?
Perfect analogy.
So it sounds like Ackerman and Tatel really poked some holes in the traditional ways of looking at this. But they didn't just critique, did they? They actually did their own study to try to address these issues.
They did, and this is where it gets even more interesting. They designed a study with 4 different tasks, each requiring different levels of procedural skills or memorized knowledge.
Okay, I'm all ears. Hit me with the experiment details. What were the tasks?
One was a high-fidelity air traffic control simulation. This one really tapped into real-time decision-making and being able to adapt on the fly.
Wow, air traffic control. Talk about a high-stakes skill. You definitely don't want someone having a senior moment with those procedures mid-flight. What else did they include?
Okay, so they also use what's called the Canfor-Ackerman air traffic control task.
Say that 5 times fast.
I know, right? It's a mouthful. It's basically a simpler version, still dealing with landing planes, but much more focused on following very specific rules and steps.
Gotcha. So 2 versions of air traffic control, one more about thinking on your feet and the other about memorizing those critical procedures. Makes sense. What were the other 2 tasks?
The other 2 involved this noun pair task. In one version, the word pairings always stayed the same, so you could memorize them pretty easily. But in the other version, the pairs changed every single time, which forced people to really search for the matches.
Interesting. So it's like the difference between memorizing your grocery list and actually having to hunt for each item in the store, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so they had their tasks, they had their participants. What did they find? Did skills just vanish into thin air?
Well, this is where it gets really fascinating. What they discovered is that how you measure performance completely changes how much skill decay you think is happening.
Wait, what do you mean how you measure? Isn't it as straightforward as did they get it right or not?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But it turns out it's way more complicated than that. Remember how we were talking about different levels of detail, like zooming in on individual moments versus looking at the bigger picture?
Right, like focusing on each brush stroke in a painting versus stepping back to see the whole artwork.
Exactly. So when they looked at the air traffic control task, if they just looked at overall performance across a bunch of trials, it actually seemed like people got better after a month.
Hold on, are you saying they actually improved after a month of not practicing? How is that even possible?
Yeah, so it seemed that way at first, but here's the thing. It all comes down to how you slice and dice the data. Remember we were talking about different levels of detail?
Right, like zooming in on the fine points versus the big picture.
Exactly. When they really zoomed in on individual trials within that month, they actually saw a significant drop in performance.
So it's like the overall picture looked good, but when you looked closer, it was a different story.
Yeah, and it all goes back to that relearning effect.
Because each trial was like a mini refresher course.
Right, exactly. Each trial gave them a chance to kind of refamiliarize themselves with the task. So those little bursts of relearning were actually masking the decay that was happening at a more granular level.
So it wasn't that they magically got better at air traffic control after a month off. It's just that they were quickly relearning bits and pieces as they went. And that created this illusion of overall improvement.
Exactly. You got it.
Fascinating. And did this pattern, this whole granular data tells a different story thing, did that show up in the other tasks too?
It did, yeah. Like in that noun pair task, when they looked at performance on those individual blocks of trials, the decay was much more obvious compared to just looking at the overall average.
So it's like those optical illusions where the image seems to change depending on how you look at it.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Okay, so zooming out a bit here, did their findings actually support their hunch about memorized or procedural skills being more likely to fade?
They did, yeah. Both that memorized noun pair task and that very procedural air traffic control task showed more decay compared to the tasks that were more flexible.
Interesting. So while having those kind of automatic procedural skills is super helpful in the moment, they might be more vulnerable to fading if we don't actively use them. Makes sense. What about relearning, though?
Oh, yeah, good point.
You mentioned earlier that relearning is usually faster than learning something for the first time. Did their study back that up?
It totally did. Even though they saw skill decay across the board, relearning was always faster than that initial learning process for every single task.
Okay, well, that's good news. So even if our skills get a little rusty, our brains hold on to some trace of that knowledge. Makes it quicker to bounce back. This has got to have some pretty big implications for how we approach learning and maintaining skills in the real world, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. This research is really relevant to all sorts of things, like take healthcare, for instance.
Okay.
You've got a surgeon who doesn't perform a certain procedure very often. This research suggests that without regular practice, their skill in that procedure could actually decline, which is kind of a scary thought.
Right. That's a great example. It really underscores how important continuous training and refreshers are, especially in fields where even a little slip up can have big consequences.
Yeah.
But it's not just about those high-stakes professions, is it?
No, not at all.
This applies to all those everyday skills and hobbies we have, too.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
think about it. That musical instrument you haven't touched in years.
Oh, tell me about it.
Or that sport you used to play. You'll probably pick it up faster than you did as a total beginner, but don't expect to be back to your old form right away. It takes practice, to rebuild those neural pathways.
Oh, I know it. I remember when I started painting again after a long break. I thought I could just jump right back in, but my brushstrokes were all over the place. My color mixing was off. It took some serious effort to get back to where I was.
Exactly. That's why this research is so important. It highlights that skill retention isn't just a black and white thing. It's not like you either have it or you don't. It's much more nuanced than that.
It's a constant process, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Learning, practicing, refreshing.
Yeah.
It all matters.
It's a good reminder that our brains are always changing and adapting.
Right.
And speaking of adapting, this research also kind of shines a light on a problem with how we often measure skill decay.
You're talking about those traditional measures like Cohen's D.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They can tell us if there's a statistically significant difference, but they don't always give us that practical information we need to actually make decisions about things like retraining.
And how often, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It's like knowing your phone battery is low, but having no clue how much longer you've got before it dies.
Mm.
What we really need is a way to translate those statistical findings into real-world predictions.
Exactly. Imagine needing to make an important call, but you have no idea if your phone's going to die on you. Those traditional measures just don't cut it.
Right, they don't give you the whole picture.
What we really need is something that tells us, okay, after 6 months without practice, a pilot's success rate on this specific maneuver drops by, say, 15%. Now that's useful. You can actually do something with that information.
Yeah, you can use that to make decisions about training schedules, safety protocols, all of that. And I think that's what's so great about Ackerman and Tatel's work.
You're just finding answers. It's about asking better questions. Exactly. They've given us this new framework for really digging into skill retention. It's about pushing the field forward.
So while we might not literally forget how to ride a bike, like that old saying goes,
Right. It's a catchy saying.
this research definitely shows us that many skills, especially those that are really procedural or rely on memorization, they do fade over time.
Yeah, there's no escaping that, it seems.
But, and this is a big but, relearning is usually faster than starting from scratch.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And if we can start to understand these decay patterns, these ups and downs of skill retention, then we can be smarter about how we maintain the skills that really matter to us.
Absolutely. Whether it's for our work, our hobbies, our everyday lives, it's all about being proactive.
And maybe the most important takeaway here is that there's still so much we don't know about skill retention. Ackerman and Tatel have opened up all these new avenues for research.
They've really given us a lot to think about and a lot more to explore. I'm really excited to see what comes next in the field.
Me too. It's a good reminder that our understanding of learning, of memory, it's always evolving, which is pretty cool when you think about it.
It is, yeah. It means we're always learning, always growing.
And with that thought, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into the fascinating world of skill decay. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What skills are you hoping will stick with you? Let us know.